Hello, friends. Are you watching this alone or with someone? Tell me in the comments.
I never expected Easter lunch to turn into a courtroom. But there I was, fork halfway to my mouth, still mid-chew, when my brother Mark, sitting smugly across the table in his tailored blue blazer and that condescending smirk he's worn since he passed the bar 15 years ago, looked up from his wine glass and, with just enough volume to be heard by everyone, tossed out, "Some of us work real jobs, others just try." For half a second, the room fell into the kind of silence you only get after someone drops a glass or says something they can't take back. And I saw Mom pause mid-carve, her knife hovering over the ham, while Dad's eyebrows twitched just slightly, his only tell when something cuts too deep. Mark's words hit me like a slap across the face, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I took a slow sip of water, set my glass down carefully, and smiled like I didn't feel the fire crawl up my spine. It wasn't the first time Mark had made a dig like that. Honestly, it had become tradition at these holiday gatherings. He'd take a shot at me, and I'd either laugh it off or say something self-deprecating just to keep the peace. That was the unspoken deal, apparently. Mark got to be the successful older brother with a house in the suburbs and a Volvo that probably cost more than my last 3 years of rent. And I was the flaky creative one who floated from freelance gigs to consulting contracts, and once, very briefly, tried running a yoga podcast. But what he didn't know, and what no one at that table knew, including my parents, was that this past year, everything had changed. I hadn't planned to tell anyone. Honestly, I didn't think they'd believe me if I did. The past 12 months had been a blur of long nights, 70-hour work weeks, relentless pitching, 3 rejected book proposals, 2 accepted contracts, and 1 particularly lucrative licensing deal that I'd never even expected to happen. Somewhere between December and February, I realized I'd earned more money than I ever had in my life, and far more than I'd ever dared to tell anyone, especially Mark. I stared at him for a beat too long, probably, and he noticed it. That smug look flickered, just for a moment, and I could see the wheels turning. He knew he'd gone too far. He always did, but he was good at brushing it off, wrapping his jabs in jokes, and shifting the focus before anyone had a chance to call him out. That was his thing. He had a way of making his insults sound like observations, like truths that were just too uncomfortable for the rest of us to admit. I excused myself from the table just as Mom started passing around the sweet potatoes, and in the quiet of the hallway, I pulled the envelope out of my coat pocket. Thick paper, crisp corners, the kind of weight you feel when you know it holds more than just numbers. Inside was a copy of my finalized tax return. I had printed it out that morning, not because I planned to bring it up, but because a part of me knew. A part of me always knew that Mark wouldn't be able to resist taking another shot. For years, I'd let it slide. He'd made jokes about my experimental lifestyle, mocked my non-linear career path, and once told a date of mine that I was a professional question mark. That one had stung. But this time, something had shifted in me. Maybe it was turning 38 and realizing I was finally in control of my life. Maybe it was the fact that I no longer needed his approval. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because I finally had proof that the path I chose wasn't a dead end after all. When I came back into the dining room, no one noticed the envelope. I slid it under my napkin and sat down quietly. The conversation had moved on to traffic, interest rates, and how many points the Dow dropped last week. Topics Mark loved to sprinkle with half-baked expertise, as if every question was an opportunity for him to hold court. I smiled politely and let him ramble, occasionally nodding at Mom or squeezing her hand under the table, while waiting patiently for dessert. It was Dad who'd insisted on lemon meringue this year, said it reminded him of the one his mom used to make when he was a kid. The moment I saw the pie come out of the kitchen, something clicked. This was it. This was the moment. I leaned back in my chair, reached for the envelope under my napkin, and held it in my lap as Mark kept going. Now he was explaining why he pulled out of a real estate deal just before the market cooled, as if he had some kind of economic sixth sense. I could feel my pulse in my ears, but my face stayed calm. The dessert plates were being passed around, and Mom had just asked me if I wanted whipped cream when I spoke up. Not loud, just enough to cut through the background hum. Actually, I said, before dessert, there's something I'd like to share with you guys. All eyes turned to me. Mark narrowed his. Dad set down his fork. I placed the envelope on the table in front of Dad and slid it toward him. It's my tax return, I said, smiling faintly. I thought you might find it interesting. For a beat, no one moved. Then Dad picked it up, pulled out the pages, and began to read. The room stayed quiet. I looked over at Mark, and for the first time that day, maybe the first time in years, I saw something new in his eyes. Not smugness, not superiority, but worry. He hadn't even seen the number yet, and dessert hadn't even started. The moment I placed that thick envelope containing my tax return in front of Dad, the tension in the room shifted noticeably. But before I reveal exactly what happened next, I need to take you back to the days leading up to that Easter lunch, because the way I planned my quiet revenge was every bit as deliberate as the moment I finally pulled it off. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. It was a slow burn fueled by years of knowing exactly how Mark liked to position himself as the family's golden child, the guy who worked real jobs, as he put it, with a sense of superiority so thick it practically cut through the air. I had learned over time that trying to meet him head-on with anger or shouting only made him double down, turning the conversation into a contest I would lose every single time. So I decided to play a different game, one where patience, strategy, and subtlety were my best allies. I started by quietly looking over my finances with fresh eyes, not because I wanted to brag or prove anything to anyone at first, but because I needed to remind myself of what I had accomplished. I printed out my tax returns, not just this year's, but the last 3 years, to see the progression, to feel the weight of every late night and every hard negotiation for contracts that nobody outside my small circle would ever hear about. What I found was staggering, even to me. The growth was real, tangible, and above all, undeniable. I earned enough last year to pay off some lingering debts, invest in a modest retirement fund, and yes, live comfortably without dipping into savings. But I never told anyone because that was never the point. What really mattered was the quiet sense of achievement I finally felt after years of being dismissed as the flaky sister who just tried. At the same time, I kept my ear to the ground about Mark's life, not out of bitterness, but curiosity, and maybe a bit of self-preservation. I knew from years of family gossip and occasional texts from mutual friends that his seemingly perfect corporate lawyer life wasn't as unblemished as he made it look. Late nights at the office didn't necessarily mean success. Sometimes they meant chaos, missed deadlines, or endless billable hours just to keep his name relevant in his firm. I even heard through the grapevine that he'd recently lost a big case, something he never wanted to talk about because his reputation was everything. I had to admit, that gave me a tiny, quiet thrill. If Mark thought I was the screw-up, maybe it was time to show him otherwise. But without blowing up the family dinner like a soap opera scene, I wanted to be clever about it. One evening, while Mom and I were clearing the dishes from the last holiday, she caught me staring at the envelope I'd tucked away and asked what was going on. I hesitated before telling her a sliver of the truth, not about the full amount or the tax return itself, but about how I was planning something to finally shift the family dynamic, or at least get a moment of recognition. Mom gave me a knowing look, the kind only a parent can give when they've watched their kids struggle for years, and quietly encouraged me. "You don't have to prove anything to Mark," she said softly, "but if you want to make your point, you better make sure it counts." That conversation stayed with me in the days that followed, pushing me to plan every detail carefully. In the days before Easter, I practiced how I would hold myself, how I would answer if Mark tried to derail me or laugh me off as usual, and how I would let Dad absorb the number and react without rushing him or pushing him to speak first. It was important, I realized, to let the silence do some of the work, to let the room feel the weight of that moment without me having to spell it out. I thought about every possible reaction from Mark, denial, anger, embarrassment, maybe even a defensive joke. But I reminded myself not to get caught up in how he might respond. This was about me finally standing in my own truth and making sure my family could no longer pretend they didn't see it. I also quietly started planting little verbal jabs in the days leading to Easter, subtle enough that no one but Mom caught on. I'd mention how challenging and exhausting the freelance life could be, throwing in things like, some of us actually build our careers brick by brick in less traditional ways, or it takes real grit to keep pushing when no one's handing you a ladder. Nothing too obvious, just enough to remind Mark that I wasn't oblivious to his digs, and I wasn't going to let them slide this time. I even posted a few carefully crafted updates on social media, designed to show, without showing off, that my career was thriving in its own way. Mark's usual rapid-fire commentary on my posts was noticeably absent, and I suspected that unsettled him more than any words I could say in person. The night before Easter, I triple-checked everything: my carefully folded tax return, the crisp envelope, the way I'd slide it across the table as though it was the most natural thing in the world, which I convinced myself it was. I rehearsed the look I'd give Mark, the one that said without speaking, "This is coming for you." What I didn't rehearse, though, was how pale he would go, or how his usual confident facade would crack when Dad, a man who rarely showed strong emotion, would read aloud that number, turning the family dinner into a battlefield I was finally ready to win. As I sat at the table that day, surrounded by familiar faces and the smell of ham and sweet potatoes, I knew this wasn't just about a tax return or a number on paper. It was about reclaiming my place in a family that had written me off for too long and proving that success doesn't always come in a suit and tie. When Dad finally looked up from those pages, his eyes meeting mine with a mix of surprise and pride, I knew the long game had paid off, and Mark's world was about to be rattled in a way none of us would soon forget. The hours leading up to Easter lunch had already been charged with an undercurrent of tension that, while unspoken, simmered beneath every word exchanged and every glance flicked across the room. And by the time we sat down to eat, the subtle game of sibling rivalry was already in full swing, played out with razor-sharp wit and carefully veiled barbs that only those who knew us well could truly understand. Mark, with his polished demeanor and smug confidence, had always wielded his success like a shield and a weapon, using his position as a corporate lawyer to remind everyone, especially me, that his version of working hard was somehow more valid, more respectable, and infinitely more impressive than my chosen path as a freelancer navigating a world that demanded constant hustle and creativity without the safety net of a steady paycheck or a traditional title. From the moment the first course was served, Mark slipped easily into his usual rhythm of domination, casually recounting stories from the legal trenches, dropping legal jargon that flew over most of our heads, but served as an unmistakable signal that he was the one who carried the weight of real work on his shoulders. And while I had long since learned to bite my tongue and smile through his tales, this time something was different. Instead of shrinking back or brushing off his remarks, I found myself quietly preparing for the moment when I could turn the tables, even as I watched the flicker of amusement and disdain in his eyes when I dared to share an anecdote about the grueling process of securing a new client, or the long nights spent rewriting a proposal to meet a stubborn editor's demands. Mom, sitting beside me, noticed the tension, but chose to say little, her eyes flicking between Mark and me with a mixture of sympathy and caution, perhaps aware that the day's peace was fragile, and that any spark could ignite something much larger, while Dad, ever the quiet observer, smiled politely but said nothing, his hands folded neatly on the table as if bracing himself for what might come. A silent reminder that beneath the surface, our family dynamics were more complex than a simple holiday gathering would suggest. As the meal progressed from appetizers to the main course, the exchange of words between Mark and me grew increasingly charged, not with overt anger, but with a sharpness that cut deeper, because it was delivered with the politeness of a civil conversation. Each jab masked as a witty retort, each smile a shield against the years of accumulated resentment that neither of us had bothered to express directly until now. I could feel the familiar knot of anxiety twist in my stomach as I kept the envelope with my tax return hidden under my napkin, a quiet secret that felt heavier with each passing minute, while Mark continued his subtle but relentless campaign of belittlement, praising his own achievements in a way that made it clear he saw mine as insignificant at best and laughable at worst. I remembered a particular moment from college, years ago, when Mark had mocked my attempts to find a steady job after graduation, scoffing at my choices as flaky experiments, and insisting that only a real career would bring respect and security, a memory that stung sharply even now. And I realized that the years had only made me more determined not to let those old wounds define me or my worth. With a calmness that surprised even myself, I matched his sarcasm with quiet confidence, hinting at the grit and persistence required to navigate the unpredictable world I inhabited. And while Mark's smirk didn't fade entirely, I caught the briefest flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a crack in the armor he wore so proudly. The conversation shifted then, just as the salad plates were cleared and the first bites of roast began to disappear, when I noticed Mark glancing nervously at his phone under the table, his usual composed expression faltering for a moment before he quickly masked it with a casual shrug. But the tension in the air was palpable, and I sensed that the game had moved beyond words and jabs into something more real, more consequential. I could almost hear the silent countdown ticking toward the moment I had been waiting for all day, the moment when the envelope would move from hidden possession to a public declaration, and when Dad's voice would break the silence with that number, loud and clear, forcing Mark to confront a reality he had long dismissed. Though I remained outwardly composed, my mind raced with a mixture of anxiety and satisfaction, knowing that the dinner was no longer just a family meal, but a battlefield where years of unspoken rivalry, jealousy, and frustration would finally collide. And I was ready to face whatever fallout came next because, for once, I was not the one on the defensive, but the one holding the trump card. As the server brought out the dessert plates, carrying the lemon meringue pie Dad had requested weeks earlier, the room held its breath in a way only families caught in moments of tension can. And I felt the weight of every eye on me as I finally prepared to reveal the secret that would change everything, even if only for a moment. The moment when dessert was served felt like the slowest and most electrifying second of the entire day. And though the lemon meringue pie glistened under the soft dining room light, looking like the harmless family tradition Dad had insisted upon, the tension that had been quietly building since Mark's jab at the start of the meal now reached a boiling point, as if the whole room collectively knew that what I was about to do would change the balance in ways none of us could yet predict, but had all been anticipating in the back of our minds. Throughout the earlier courses, I had carefully observed Mark's demeanor. His once unshakable confidence began to show cracks. The slightest twitch in his jaw or the nervous tapping of his fingers on the table betrayed the unease he was trying so hard to suppress. And in the fleeting moments when he thought no one was looking, his gaze flicked toward his phone again, as though he were searching for some reassurance or distraction from the storm gathering around him. Before the meal, I had made a quiet decision to keep my actions measured and indirect, wanting the reveal to sting not only because of the number on the page, but because it challenged the very narrative Mark had spun for so long, that my life was an unstable series of half-hearted attempts rather than meaningful, hard-earned success. And though I had been tempted to call him out loudly and publicly, I knew that would have only made me look bitter and petty, and the last thing I wanted was to stoop to his level. Instead, I had laid the groundwork subtly, weaving in quiet comments, hints about the struggles and the triumphs that came from working outside the traditional corporate world, and planting seeds of doubt about Mark's infallibility among some of his own friends and colleagues. Whispers that I had heard through mutual acquaintances suggesting that his recent legal victories were far from guaranteed, and that the stress was beginning to show behind his polished exterior. Now, with the tax return envelope resting under my napkin, I felt the weight of every expectation, every past slight, and every moment of being dismissed by my family like a shadow lurking beneath the surface of their conversations. I glanced at Mom, whose eyes sparkled with quiet pride, and perhaps a touch of relief that I was finally standing up for myself in a way she had hoped to see for years, but had been too afraid to push. And then to Dad, whose lined face was unreadable, but whose hands tightened around the edge of the tablecloth as if bracing himself for the impact of what was to come. I reached slowly beneath the napkin and slid the envelope forward, pushing it directly in front of Dad, who paused mid-bite and raised his eyebrows in mild surprise, then took the envelope with deliberate care as though it held something fragile or dangerous. The room fell into a heavy silence as he unfolded the pages inside, and I could see him scanning the figures, the detailed columns of income and deductions, the official stamp that made everything feel indisputable. And then, slowly, his eyes lifted from the paper to meet mine, a mixture of astonishment and cautious approval flickering there. Mark's face, which had been so animated just moments before, turned pale in an instant. His usual confident smirk wiped clean as if someone had pressed the reset button on his ego, and I caught the almost imperceptible quiver in his lips as he struggled to maintain composure, though his hands betrayed him, gripping the edge of the table as if to anchor himself against a wave of embarrassment or perhaps disbelief. Dad cleared his throat and, without hesitation, read the number aloud, the official income figure echoing throughout the room louder than I had intended, but perfectly calculated to shatter the illusion Mark had so carefully maintained about who was the real success in the family. The words hung there, heavy and undeniable, while I sat back and watched the shifting expressions around the table, Mom's quiet, approving smile, Dad's thoughtful gaze, and Mark's dawning realization that the safe narrative he had built for years was crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of cold, hard facts. Mark opened his mouth to protest, to dismiss the number as a fluke or some kind of accounting error, but the words caught in his throat as I calmly explained how the income had been earned, the countless nights spent pitching and negotiating, the contracts that were the result of my own sweat and persistence, and not just luck or charity, as he might have assumed. What surprised me most in that moment was the mixture of silence and murmur that followed, as if the family was collectively reassessing everything they thought they knew about me, about Mark, and about the fragile definitions of success we all clung to so tightly, while I felt an unexpected surge of vindication and sadness all at once. Vindication because I had finally made my point without stooping to insults or petty fights, and sadness because I knew that even this moment of truth would not erase years of judgment or change the complicated feelings my family had about me overnight. As dessert plates were pushed closer and the room slowly began to fill again with small talk and awkward laughter, I caught Mark's eyes once more and saw in them not just defeat, but something deeper, fear, confusion, and maybe, just maybe, a grudging respect that would take much longer to express, if ever. The battle lines had been drawn clearly now, and though I had won this round, I knew that the fallout would ripple far beyond this table, changing the way we saw each other and ourselves, and leaving us all to grapple with the new truths that had been laid bare between bites of lemon meringue. As the last of the lemon meringue pie was sliced, and the soft murmur of post-dessert conversation began to fill the room, the air still carried the weight of what had just transpired moments earlier. The moment when the quiet envelope containing my tax return had been placed firmly in front of Dad, whose voice reading the numbers aloud had shattered the carefully constructed illusion Mark had so long relied upon, to assert his dominance in both our family and his own mind. In that instant, the room had shifted from a typical holiday gathering into a charged arena of unspoken reckonings, where pride, resentment, and buried truths collided with a force that left none of us untouched, especially Mark, whose usual composure had given way to a pale, strained expression that revealed more vulnerability than I had ever seen from him before. And though he tried to mask it with a forced smile and defensive words, it was clear the carefully cultivated image of superiority had cracked irreparably. Mark's initial protestations were quick but faltering, stumbling over explanations and half-hearted denials as he attempted to deflect attention from the startling truth of my income. trying to frame it as a fluke or an anomaly that didn't represent the real-world work he believed mattered most. Yet his voice lacked the usual certainty and bite, betraying a deep-seated insecurity that I had sensed for years but had never been so plainly exposed. I countered calmly and deliberately, recounting the endless hours I had poured into my work, the negotiations that had taken me from doubt to contract, the sleepless nights and rejections that made every dollar on that page a hard-won victory, emphasizing not the number itself, but the story behind it, a story that had been invisible to everyone who had dismissed me as aimless or flaky. Around the table, the expressions of those who had watched this long-running sibling rivalry unfold were a complex mixture of surprise, discomfort, and in Mom's case, a quiet pride that softened her usually worried gaze, while Dad remained stoic but with a hint of approval in his eyes, as if acknowledging silently that the sister he had often worried about was finally claiming the recognition she deserved, even if the moment was bittersweet and complicated by years of unspoken tension and fractured expectations. The other guests, some family friends and a couple of distant cousins, exchanged glances that suggested they were witnessing a rare and raw moment, a peeling back of facades that revealed the complicated human emotions beneath the veneer of polite gatherings and holiday cheer. In the wake of the reveal, conversation grew hesitant and guarded, the easy flow of small talk replaced by a careful navigation around the elephant in the room, while Mark's usual confidence had been replaced by a palpable sense of discomfort that was difficult to ignore, and I could see him weighing his options, whether to lash out, retreat, or perhaps even, in a way that surprised me, to reflect and reconsider the role he had played not just in the family, but in the way he had framed his own success at the expense of mine. Though no immediate apology came, the shift in his demeanor was unmistakable, and I felt a strange mix of triumph and melancholy, knowing that while I had won this battle of revelations, the deeper wounds between us were still raw and unresolved. The evening wound down with a fragile civility, but beneath the surface, I could sense that nothing would be quite the same again. The stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and our siblings, about who works real jobs and who just tries, had been challenged. And even if the family tried to return to normal, the truth had been laid bare in a way that demanded acknowledgement and perhaps, eventually, understanding. As I looked around the table one last time before leaving, I caught Mom's smile, warm and knowing, and Dad's quiet nod. And though Mark's eyes avoided mine, I sensed that the moment had planted a seed of change, difficult as it would be to nurture. Driving home later that evening, I felt a strange mixture of relief, exhaustion, and cautious hope swirling inside me, knowing that while the battle for recognition within my family had been won, the war of rebuilding relationships and healing old wounds was only just beginning, and I was left wondering how long it would take before Mark could see me not as a rival or a failure, but as the person I had fought so hard to become, strong, successful, and unapologetically myself, standing tall at the family table, finally seen on my own terms.